You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Well, here we are. Another day, another dollar. Unfortunately, I'm a volunteer, so I don't get paid, do I? No, I'll have to talk to 3CR management about that with the other 400 volunteers that keep this station on air 24 hours a day. Now, I'd like to thank all those people who contributed to the Radiothon. I'm not sure of our exact total, but I know that everybody's paid up, and it's over 12,000. So we'll give you an exact total next week. Now, I'd just like to remind you, next Wednesday, which is the 9th of July, dinner. That's right. Public interest before corporate interest dinner at the Narada Cafe at the corner of Albion Street and Breeze, Breaze Street in Brunswick, starting at 6:30pm. Now, don't let me down. I know it's winter. I know you all don't want to go out on a cold winter's night, but it's a great way to meet like-minded people and have a good social occasion, free of the constraints of social media. So let's hope we will see you there next Wednesday night. And don't forget, we're almost reached 10 years of the vigil on the steps of Victorian Parliament House. This Thursday, 12 to 1, public housing, everybody's business. The sacred cows are with us. We're about to blast off to Sydney. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network, broadcast east and west, north and south, and who knows where. What community radio station picks up the Anarchist World This Week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting this program in the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Darryl will make sure the podcast is up within the next 24 to 48 hours. And if you wonder what anarchy is all about, anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers, not without rules. And what gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. The anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve or share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. And when you look at what's happening around the world today, you can understand that we are so far away from those concepts. Increasing concentration of power, increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a minuscule minority causes many, not all, but most of the problems that we face as individuals, communities, nation-states, and citizens of the globe, or citizens of Earth. Let's start off with public housing. Look, it was my delight yesterday to address a small public housing gathering outside the Office of Homes Victoria, Homes and Fairness Victoria. Because obviously, as we've seen over the last 50 years, privatisation is the main game. And what we are seeing in Victoria and what we've seen around the country, to a lesser degree, is the privatisation of the public housing sector. The public housing sector has been handed over to the community, affordable, social, whatever you like to call themselves, sector, which are basically privately owned, privately managed organisations. End of story. Now, the beauty of living in public housing is that public housing should be publicly owned and publicly managed. But we've now reached a situation in the state of Victoria where the state government is demolishing at a rapid rate huge amounts of public housing stock around the state, giving it away to the private sector and for the benefit of creating 10% community, social, affordable housing, not public housing. So now, why is public housing everybody's business? And I'm going to go through this again because unfortunately Radical politics, even revolutionary politics, is about repetition. Repetition. I'll say it again. Repetition. In a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit, in order for people living in a capitalist society to gain the best advantage or find themselves in the best situation, is therefore if there is competition. Privatisation of public assets and public institutions has resulted in a lack of competition. This lack of competition has created duopolies and monopolies which are, in most cases, able to set any price they like regarding their goods and services. Nothing highlights this more than the tragedy that we're seeing in the housing sector. Now, those of you who keep your eyes out on the increase in value of your home, if you've got one, you may be pleased to know that the median price of a house in Sydney is $1.2 million. Even winning Tats Lotto may not cover that. You can't even buy a house anymore. I think in Queensland it's about 920 or 950,000, and the list goes on and on. So we've seen a ridiculous situation where wages have increased 7-fold since the 1980s, but housing prices have increased 40-fold for a variety of reasons, and to a significant degree, one of these reasons is the lack of competition in the housing sector, because the housing sector is totally dominated by the private sector, whether it's building, whether it's selling. It's dominated by the private sector, so competition is minimal. And to make matters worse, there's obviously government legislation which encourages investment in the housing sector, where what is theoretically a right becomes a commodity. So why is public housing everybody's business? It's very simple. Even an idiot like me can work this out. And if I can work it out, I'm sure our political masters can work it out also. It's very simple. The bigger, the more extensive the public housing sector in a community, or let's say a state, as we're a federation of states, the less power the private sector is able to exercise in the marketplace. And again, I'm talking about a capitalist economy, because you've got real competition. The more people who are housed in public housing, the less demand for rental space. As the demand for rental space decreases, investors move out of the rental market into another market, housing prices drop at the lower end of the market, and rents drop. It's very simple. Now in Victoria, we have taxes. That's right, sales tax on property. You know, when you buy a property, a significant proportion goes to the state government. I expect the state government will, obtain maybe 6, 8, 12, I'm not sure, $1 billion this year in revenue from taxing, housing, sales tax on housing. So that means if that money was quarantined to create increasing public housing stock, which could be built by a publicly owned, government-owned building company, we could house over 100,000 Victorians every year. But this doesn't happen. All we see is a continuing escalation of the destruction of public housing, especially in Victoria, which is the leader in terms of destruction of public housing across this country. So no wonder real estate prices continue to rocket. No wonder rents are so high. No wonder so many people are wasting so much of their income on paying rent or mortgages. And we find ourselves in this situation where governments at the state and federal level are not willing, refuse point blank to invest in the public housing sector. So, the ball's in your court. There are rallies, there are issues, but the important thing is we need to understand this is not just about a minority. This is not just about the 2.5% of Victorians and the small number of people in public housing around the country. This is about everybody, because the stronger the public housing sector, the greater the competition in a capitalist economy, the greater the competition, downward pressure on rents, downward pressure on housing prices, which means more people are able to obtain secure housing. Because the beauty of being in public housing is, unless you're a total bastard, you are not going to get evicted. You could live in that home, unless the government decides to demolish it, for the most of your life. You could send your kids to the same school, the same sporting clubs. You could be part of the same community. At the same time, public housing rents in Victoria are limited to 25% of income. So that means people on social security benefits, limited incomes, do not have to waste the majority of their benefit to keep a roof over their head. This is so simple. For the last 9.5 years, we've been having a vigil on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House, raising these issues every week. And the response from the passing traffic is 95% positive. The response from the Victorian government and opposition, the government in waiting, is nil. N-I-L. So unless more people get involved in the public housing struggle because they understand that it's everybody's business, it's not about charity, it's not about morality, it's not about ethics, it's about ensuring that everybody has an affordable roof over their heads. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Let's move on. Well, the carnage continues. Now, I want to talk about hypocrisy. The carnage continues. According to some estimates, over 60,000 Gazans, this is the 2 million people living in an area half the size of Melbourne or Sydney, have been slaughtered in the last 18 months. And that's the key word, slaughter. This is not a war. You've got one side with tanks and planes and fully equipped troops, and you've got another side with, holy polygot, militia. It's not a war. It's carnage. Now, I understand that this punk band, poor people, said something very, very bad. And it was even raised in the British Parliament, and the BBC was admonished for, showing the clips of these people. And they had this slogan, very catchy slogan, I think, especially if you're a musician, and you're into catchy slogans. The slogan was, deaf to the I.D.F. Sounds, it's got a bit of rhythm, hasn't it? Deaf to the I.D.F. Now let's look at the history of the Israeli Defence Forces in this current uprising in Gaza. Let's not forget the major reason over 1,200 Israelis were murdered, and that's the key word, murdered, by Hamas militants, is because the Israeli Defence Forces were caught napping. I mean, Mossad, which is supposed to be the world's best, intelligence agency, didn't even realise that Hamas would break out of Gaza. And we saw the collapse of the Israeli Defence Forces in the first 48 hours. So let's not forget the murder of the 1,200 plus Israelis by Hamas in October 2023 was a direct consequence of the failure of Mossad, the Israeli Defence Forces and the Netanyahu government to protect its citizens. Since then, they have been involved in a campaign to destabilise their neighbours, whether it's Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran. For what purpose? And at the same time, they have been involved in they have been totally responsible for the carnage which has occurred in Gaza. Now, some elements say over 60,000 Gazans have died directly as a result of Israeli bombing, shelling, shooting. Some say 60 to 70% are women and children. Others put the figures at 100,000. We've seen starvation used as a weapon. We now see reports coming out of Gaza, reports which we knew about weeks ago, that the I.D.F has been using live firepower against unarmed civilians, which pose no threat to it. Now, what I find extraordinary is the number of Israeli soldiers, many of them conscripts, who are willing to obey orders. To a significant degree, it reminds me of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi after Nazi after Nazi appeared with the excuse, I was just obeying orders. Now, the Nuremberg trials clearly said that the individual is ultimately responsible for their actions. We are seeing psychological tactics which are being used in Gaza, which are reminiscent of the tactics which were used by the Nazis against Jews. Humiliation, degradation, separation, marginalisation. And in many regards, what is happening in Gaza has parallels with the early phases of the Nazis' campaign against Jews, which then was transformed into the Holocaust. What you need to do in these situations is to ensure that the other, in the mind of the aggressor, is somehow not worthy of existence, because somehow they are not human. They're subhuman. This is the psychology of genocide. This is psychology. We've seen the Iraq report here in Victoria, where obviously everybody's known for generations that colonisation was about genocide. And genocide is possible when you are able to identify the other as somehow not worthy of your considerations because they are subhuman. And degradation, humiliation, marginalisation is part and parcel of the way you create the psychology amongst people that accept these atrocities. And we are seeing these atrocities played out before us in the 21st century. Now, the hypocrisy of some punk group being investigated by the Victoria Police, not Victoria, my apologies, I'm getting a bit, I'm sure that'll happen here one day, but some punk group being investigated by the British police and questions raised in the British Parliament and the wholesale condemnation of two punk, activists, musicians, chanting, deaf, deaf to the I.D.F, it's got a bit of a ring to it, deaf, deaf to the I.D.F, is the tantamount hypocrisy. Now, obviously, many people who have taken, who are appalled, including many Jewish activists, who are appalled by the atrocities which are being committed by the pariah state, Israel, which is led by a war criminal, Netanyahu, who are appalled by these actions, have suffered consequences for standing up to this slaughter. This is not about left or right, good or bad, Hamas or Israel. This is about mass slaughter on an industrial scale by a nation state on people who they displaced over 70 years ago. We've seen a number of people suffer for standing up. We saw the Senator for West Australia, the Labor Senator, stood up to the Albanese government. She was expelled, basically, from the Labor Party. She walked away. We've seen the case regarding the broadcaster Lattouf, where the Fair Work Commission found that she was dismissed unfairly because ABC management panicked. We saw a very important artist who was denied the opportunity to attend the Venice Biennale, the most important arts festival in the world, because of his position on Palestine. We have seen people who've lost their jobs in this country because of their position on Palestine. We see the same thing around the globe. But when two punk musicians stand up and say, deaf, deaf to the I.D.F, all hell breaks loose. When 60, 70, 80,000 Palestinians died directly, and I'm not even talking about the indirect deaths in Gaza, because of the failures of the Israeli state, to contain Hamas initially in October 2023, it's as if all hell has broke loose, as I said before. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. And what does the Israeli state gain from these atrocities, from its bombing of Iran? Maybe it's put back its nuclear ambitions a few months. Obviously, it's the best recruitment agency for Hamas in the Middle East. I mean, could you imagine the generations of children? Many of them have been blown to bits, who've seen their brothers and sisters, their mothers, their fathers living in tents, blown to bits. Can you imagine the hatred that's grown in their hearts? Can you imagine what it's like not to be able to attend school for 2 years? Could you imagine what it's like facing starvation and seeing your younger siblings, facing malnutrition? The constant bombing. Now, obviously, the Israeli tactic is simple. They want to create a buffer state in northern Gaza, and push the 2 million people back into central and southern Gaza, somehow thinking that if there is a buffer between Palestinians living in Gaza and the Israeli state, that the problem will be resolved. The can has been kicked back, kicked down the road a few years, but it is no way gone to addressing, let alone, finding a solution to this issue. And on top of that, we have the United States government applauding these atrocities. We saw what happened in Iran when oil supplies were threatened, and the buffoon in Washington put pressure on the Israeli government to stop the bombing in Iran. We saw what happened. Now this carnage, this slaughter can stop tomorrow if Israel's big brother is willing to stop the arms shipments which allow the Israeli state to use the latest technology to kill thousands of people in this exercise which they describe as the survival of the existential survival of the Israeli state. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. But what do you expect in a world which has no ethics, no morals, and is only interested in ensuring that those who rule continue to rule? You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Remember 1964, when Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States of America, toured Australia, and some protest in Melbourne, attempted to stop the motorcade, and they were ostracised. Remember the chant? All the way with LBJ. Well, we now have a new chant. USA, USA, all the way with the USA. Now, we've just had an interesting decision being given by the U.S. Supreme Court, because people forget that not only has the buffoon in Washington, the Buffalini in Washington, have absolute power in terms of a cowed Senate and a Congress, he also has absolute power in terms of the judges which were appointed to the United States Supreme Court. Of the 9 judges, 6 are in the pocket of the buffoon. Now, they've just made an interesting, a fascinating ruling which has major implications for Americans, the land of the brave and the free. The Supreme Court gave a decision which basically has given the executive, which is basically the buffoon and his cabinet, the ability to pass any executive order they like without it being able to be impeded in lower courts. So that means that the executive could issue executive orders which are contrary to the American Constitution, and Americans love to think that their Constitution, is the mother of all constitutions, and no lower court can block that order, and only the Supreme Court can actually make a decision on that order. The fact is that it may take 2 to 3 years before an executive order is examined by the Supreme Court. So that means that executive orders which are clearly violate the United States Constitution can be put in place and people be deported and jailed while that order is then examined by the U.S.A. Supreme Court. What a victory. What a victory for the buffoon and his mob. USA, USA, all the way with USA. Let's see how far Mr. Albanese and the Labor Party bend to the will of the USA. Interestingly, Mr. Musk, I kept saying, Mr. Musk, that billionaire whose cars kind of took a nosedive. Well, Mr. Musk is a little bit upset with the buffoon. And he's talking about creating a third party in the US. Now, he's got the money to do it. His money did help the buffoon get into power. So let's see what happens now that they've passed the big, beautiful bill. Now, interestingly, I'm sure you all know the phrase, money talks, money bends iron bars. Now, it looks like, let's not forget, that the world is not just the U.S.A. There are about 350 million people in a population of 8 billion. You know, and money these days flows, and it flows here and there. And what money is looking for is stability. stability. They want to find themselves in a situation where the government of the day doesn't face major opposition. They like stability, because with stability you make profits. With instability you can lose everything. And guess what's happening as I speak? Investment companies, hedge funds, corporations are slowly moving their assets and their money from the land of the brave and the free to Europe, to Asia. And we're seeing a rapid fall in the value of the American dollar, United States dollar, as money leaves the United States and goes elsewhere to what they believe are more stable environments. So, of all those of you who are going to travel in the next 6 to 12 months, it's good news. The Australian dollar will increase in value. It's already up to, I think, about 66 cents, per American dollar. That means you'll get a better holiday. So there's always a silver lining to every cloud. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Let's move on. Now, I know you think we don't belong to the Pacific. We're part of the west coast of the United States. Well, we are grounded in the Pacific, the South Pacific. Now, something very interesting should happen on the 1st of September 2027. And what is that? The emergence of a new nation state in the Pacific. There hasn't been an emergence of a new nation state since the creation of South Sudan about a decade ago. Now, the people of Bougainville have always resisted being part of Papua New Guinea. Different culture, different language, different people. And what we saw in the 1980s was the wholesale exploitation of the copper and gold deposits, which are quite extensive, on Bougainville by Rio Tinto. And we saw a revolt by a significant proportion of the inhabitants in the 1980s, which led to the death of over 20,000 Bougainvillians from a population of less than 200,000 in the 1980s. And Australia, yes, good old Australia in the 1990s, late 1980s and early 1990s, was instrumental in providing helicopter gunships to the Papua New Guinea government, which they use extensively in Bougainville, and also set up a naval blockade around Bougainville to stop aid coming to them from the Solomon Islands. Now, the end of that conflict saw a referendum, and this is what I call North Korean numbers and Putin numbers. The people of Bougainville voted 97.75% for independence independence from Papua New Guinea. And under a peace agreement which had been signed, that independence would begin on the 1st of September 2027. Today we have over 300,000 people living on Bougainville. Most of their income comes from the Papua New Guinea government. They do have extensive deposits of gold, and I think it was copper, I could be wrong, extensive deposits. Some say it's worth up to $100 billion. Now, obviously, if they achieve independence on the 1st of September 2027, they will need some type of income stream, and most likely it will come from mining. So keep your ears and eyes open. Will the Papua New Guinea government allow an independent Bougainville to be formed on the 1st of September 2027 according to the peace agreement they had signed post the Bougainville conflict? And will, and this is the important thing, and will the Australian government support that independence? Now, the people of Bougainville have a long, memory. And they know the negative impact that the Australian involvement in the war, in the independence war in Bougainville, created in the mind of many, if not most, of the Bougainvillians. And they're very suspicious of the Australian government's motives and whether they will pressure the Papua New Guinea government to do what they promised to do in the peace treaty, to allow the people of Bougainville to become independent and to determine their own future. You're listening to The Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Now, I understand if you've got a bit of money, there's a steelworks up for grab in South Australia, the Whyalla Steel Works. Now, I hope I've got this right. I also understand the Whyalla Steel Works produces about 80% of the steel which is used in this country. And if you believe the South Australian Premier, and who am I not to believe the South Australian Premier, he is a Premier, there are 30 corporations and hedge funds knocking on the door wanting to buy the Whyalla Steel Works, which has been put into administration by the South Australian government. Now, look, as I said before, I'm a bit slow, okay? I'm a bit slow. All right. Now, I think what COVID-19 did is it showed us that how important supply chains are. What's a supply chain? That means if you need something which is essential to your particular part of the world, if it's got to come from 20 or 15,000 kilometres away, there's a great possibility it'll never arrive, and you want your supply chain as short as possible. Now, obviously, steel is an essential component of an industrialised society. And although we have, I think, 2 or 3 other steelworks in Australia, the Whyalla Steel Works was basically responsible for producing domestic steel. Now, wouldn't this be a wonderful opportunity for the federal government to buy out Whyalla Steel and make it into a publicly owned company? Not publicly listed on the share market, but publicly owned. Now, obviously, this is not the type of policy that our federal government, which is enamoured of privatisation in the private sector, is willing to go down. But the Labor Party has a great majority. I'm sure the Greens in the Senate would approve. And I'm sure 90% of Australians would approve having a publicly owned steelwork, which then is in a position to provide the steel which is required in this country. But there's no debate. No debate. about whether it should be in public hands or not. It's all about another private sector company coming in and taking it over. It's just extraordinary. Sometimes I wonder why I woke up. It's extraordinary. Anybody with one synaptic neuron in their brain, not even half a brain or a quarter of a brain, just one synaptic neuron from the billions of synaptic neurons we have in our brain, would understand that the production of steel is a fundamental aspect of any industrialised society, and not to have that essential service or essential product in the hands of the government of the day is a lost opportunity. And that's what we're going to see over the next 3 years of this Labor government, which is not willing to go back to supporting publicly owned entities. Let's move on. Tax reform. We've been told it's going to be about tax reform. The government's going to be about tax reform and productivity. Well, are we going to see more lost opportunities? That's what I'm interested in. Are we going to see more lost opportunities? What do you think? Well, I don't know. But listening to the possible list of tax reforms which are up for debate, I think we are. Now, I haven't seen any discussion or debate about a financial transaction tax, which could raise over $100 billion a year. I've seen a lot of debate about increasing the GST, the goods and services tax, which has the most impact on those with the least. But I haven't seen any discussion regarding a 1% financial transaction tax. I've seen no discussion regarding a 1% stock market tax. It's not even on the list. Maybe there's 100 proposals. None of those proposed on the list. And in an era of artificial intelligence, well, I don't know what's artificial about it, because it is created by human beings. No discussion about a universal basic income. What are we going to do with all those people who are going to be unemployed? Not unemployable, but unemployed. What are we going to do? Are we going to have a lot of circuses like during the Roman Empire? The height of the Roman Empire, 246 public holidays for the plebs. We could have a football match every day. You know, AFL one day, world soccer, world football another day, rugby league another day, rugby union, male, female. You could even have mixed teams. Wow. Free entry. No discussion about a universal basic income. No discussion about how to deal with the fact that with artificial intelligence and increasing mechanisation and the digital revolution, that not every individual needs to be part of the paid workforce to survive. So let's see what happens with the tax reform debate. But, you know, I don't want to put cold water on it. At least they're going to have a debate. But let's see some people who've got different views to the prevailing economic orthodoxy, which is based on creating ever-increasing profits for a shrinking number of corporations, actually get a Guernsey at any tax reform debate. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Now, I'm not going to talk about deaf in custody. We all are familiar with what's happening in this country's detention centres, both for Indigenous, especially for Indigenous and non-Indigenous prisoners. But there is one tragedy which needs to be raised, and that is the judicial murder, I call it, of Cleveland Dodd. A 16-year-old youth, he took his own life after spending 85 days in 20-hour solitary confinement in Unit 18, a youth detention centre in West Australia, placed in an adult prison. Now, the shortcomings have been highlighted by the Supreme Court in West Australia. They've been highlighted by the Coroner's Court. Obviously, the devastation caused to his immediate family is extraordinary. But there is no debate in West Australia regarding closing down Unit 18. We're seeing the same insane solutions being used to deal with youth crime, which have been tried in the past. I mean, there were 242 hanging offences in the late 18th century in Great Britain. They had to open up a penal colony in New South Wales in order to deal with the overflow of prisoners. The facts are that youth detention centres for the majority of young people not only fail young people, but they fail us as a society, because all they do is create resentment and a new wave of criminals in society. But Unit 18 seems to be a sacred cow in the eyes of the West Australian government. So let's keep an eye on that, because you know, I know, there are certain things which are totally unacceptable. But when you have a media and a social media which drums on about youth crime, and I'm not saying youth crime isn't an issue, it is an issue, when for many young people they see no future for themselves in this society, because there is no future for themselves in this society, that we need to look at other ways of dealing with this issue. And if we don't, well then this will continue to happen ad nauseum. Early childhood development. Now, I'm not going to make any comments regarding the charges that have been laid against an individual, but I'm sure you've all had your fill of how the corporate-owned media, and to a lesser extent the government-gelded ABC, has been dealing with this issue. Now, the fact is, the federal government pours billions of dollars into the private sector, which is involved in early childhood development. Billions of dollars, because in Australia in 2025, we have liberated everybody to become a wage slave. And if two people in a couple don't both work, then there's never enough income to meet your increasing costs. So the early childhood development is really not about early childhood development. It's about creating a system where young children can be left while their parents enter the paid workforce. It's that simple. Very simple. It's not like a universal basic income where people have options. Well, I'll stay home and look after my kids. All right? They don't have options. The financial pressures are so extreme and so demanding that the great majority of people need to use early childhood development institutions to leave their children there. Now, what we've seen in the last 10 years during the privatisation of this sector, and let's not forget that much of this sector was not corporate controlled. What we've seen is government funding going into the corporatisation of early childhood development, and we have just a small number of corporations which now run the majority of childhood development centres, irrespective of the name they trade under. So what we've seen is the creation of institutions with a casualised workforce, which to a significant degree has been poorly paid for decades, has been created in order to provide that basic care. But at the same time, in order to make a profit, what has occurred that the checks and balances which are necessary within those institutions are not carried out because they have an impact on profitability for the corporate sector. Now, obviously, if the person who's been charged with these offences is guilty of these offences after, the relevant court cases, what will happen is everybody will forget about it. They'll forget about the debate. They'll forget the real reasons why this has occurred. This is like the aged care sector, where we saw a Royal Commission highlight that the aged care sector in this country is not fit for purpose. It's the same with the early childhood development sector, because in the rush to create profits for a shrinking number of corporations, which basically rely on billions of dollars of taxpayers' funds, we have cut corners. And if you cut corners, you will eventually be found out. That's the dilemma that we all face. You will be found out. So when we look at issues, it's just not about concentrating on that one single issue. It's about trying to join the dots. Think about it. Join the dots. Why are there these systemic failures? Why do we have the same reports over and over and over again? Why can't we as a people provide these basic services? Why do we need to rely on the government of the day to pay private corporations to provide these services? We saw this with the privatisation of the job network, where we now have private organisations which run it. And everywhere you've seen this privatisation occur, you've seen issues arise because the end point is profitability. And in order to increase profitability, you either squeeze your workers, which we've seen in the childcare sector, and if you don't squeeze your workers, what you do is you reduce the number of people that are involved in regulating or checking the system. This is what happens when you have wholesale privatisation of what are essential services in our community. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. 3cr.org.au. The program is a podcast, so if you've missed part of it and for some reason you want to listen to the other part, well, the program is podcast. Go to 3cr.org.au. There's hundreds of Anarchist World this week that are podcast, and instead of binging, on some crappy pro-television serial, why don't you binge on Anarchist World This Week podcast? Maybe it'll help you join the dots about the type of society we live in. You can binge in many ways. Now, if you want to binge of over 350 20 to 25 minute polemics, you like that, polemics? On YouTube, go to Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, Public Interest Before Corporate Interests. I look at many of the issues, put up one a week, have a look at that. If you're interested in Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, you can join them by going, and I'm actually the registered officer, go to pibci, pibci.net. It is just so easy. You don't have to pay anything. You can join online. It is so easy. If you're unhappy with the situation, political situation, interested in joining a group that both uses direct action and parliamentary politics, then have a look at their website. And if you like what you see, join. What else? You can write to me. Yes, I still read letters. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can leave pleasant messages on 0439 395 489. I delete unpleasant ones. Listen to The Anarchist World this week on your local community station next week.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.